Welcome friends, in this video we're going to take a look at transactions. So a transaction, roughly speaking, is defined basically as a unit of work. And the good thing about a transaction is that either it's completed or it's not. You see? So transactions help to ensure database consistency. You don't have, for example, just partly filled tables and strange things like that. Either something is completely finished or it's not. Okay? So everything is in a consistent, good state. Imagine, for example, if I said to you on a piece of paper, write down 5 pieces of information about yourself that I consider to be important, but you write down only 3, and then you throw the pen away, and you say, I don't want to do this anymore, then from my perspective, you haven't completed your unit of work. You have provided me with incomplete information, you see? So if I could have a mechanism in place to force everybody, for example, who comes to see me and then writes down 5 pieces of information, I would say, okay, you begin the transaction, you've got to go through it. That means you've got to give me all of the information. Then you've got to commit that transaction completely, close it, you see? And then you can leave. But you can't just leave your information in an incomplete, inconsistent state where you give me, for example, 3 of the 5 things that I need. All right, that's the kind of simple, I think, underpinning behind transactions. So let's take a look here. I'm going to say use and then my dbase go. And we're going to illustrate this by making a small table and then filling the table with some random values. So use my dbase and go. Now, because I've been experimenting on my system, I may have a table called temp. So the first thing that I'm going to do is drop it. I'm going to say drop table temp. In case I have it, because I've been experimenting, let me just check. So hit that execute. All right, it doesn't exist. That's good. But again, if you have an object and it exists, I've shown you a couple different things. You can do it with the if object ID exists, get rid of it, or you can just say drop table or whatever the object happens to be. All right, so I'm going to leave that there because if you do it a couple times, you have to drop it. So next I'm going to say this. I'm going to say create and then table temp, and then ID integer, and then value float. Those are just data types. So you're going to make a simple table which has 2 fields. It's named ID, an integer, and then another value called value, and that's the data type is float. That's all. And once we fill it, we'll look at it, you'll see what float represents better. So the next stage, remember, we're talking about transactions here, and we've defined them basically as units of work that begin, execute completely, and then end. So I'm going to say this. I'm going to say declare at insert transaction. So what I'm doing now is basically creating a variable that will store the name of our transaction to show you that that's possible. And I will say here varchar equals insert transactions, our transaction like that. So we're declaring a variable named insert transact. It's of data type varchar, and then the default value that it has here is insert transaction. That's all. That's what I'm calling it, okay? At the next stage here, I'm going to type declare and then counter. And set that default value to 1. And remember, we're going to make a table. We've done that with create table temp, and now we're going to fill it with random values. So to accomplish that, I'll type the following. I'll say begin transaction. All right, so we've got our transaction names. We've got the default value here of insert transaction. Let's continue. And remember, we're going to use a while loop to fill our table with random values. So I'm going to say this next. I will say declare and then at counter equals 1, integer equals 1 to be more exact. So we're making a counter variable. The data type is integer. The default value is 1. That's where it begins. Next stage, I'm going to say while at counter is say less than or equal to 100. So I'm just randomly making up the fact that I want to fill 100 records. That's why I have 100 here. Nothing special about it. It could be 50 or 90, whatever you want it to be. Right, remember we need the begin and the end because you want the while loop to control the block of code that follows it. So go with the beginning and the end. as shown here. And I'm going to indent these a little bit just to show that they're kind of subordinate to the while loop, okay? And then I'm going to indent the code that goes between the begin and the end. So remember, the begin and the end define a block controlled by the while loop. Anything between them will execute. So what we're going to do next is type this. We'll say begin transaction. And then you can, for example, stick in this. So insert transact. You're beginning the transaction. And now you choose to define the transaction as you want, obviously, depending on what you need. But what I will do is type this. I'll type insert. And again, I will nest this. I indent things to show you kind of structure of things more clearly. So insert into temp and then values. And then add counter. And then rand multiplied, say, by 1,000, like that. So what this is doing is this. Remember, we have this counter. I arbitrarily decided that I'm going to do this 100 times or fewer, so less than or equal to 100. I'm going to have the begin and the end, which apply to the while loop, and within that, I'm going to have another begin, which applies to the transaction. So I'm going to open a transaction. So remember, it's a unit of work to be completed from beginning to end. And then after that, I'm going to type this. Commit transaction, okay? And then add insert transact. So I'm just going to commit that transaction, meaning completed. Remember, the benefit of transactions is if you can't commit it, doesn't get saved, and that's good. It's like saying, for example, imagine you come to me and I ask you to write down 5 pieces of information, but you write down only 2, and then you have to leave. Then in a certain way, what this is saying relative to that analogy is even the 2 pieces of information you have written down wouldn't be saved. Everything is lost. So this way you don't end up with any partial, incomplete information, you see? That's a big idea here. That's what we mean by data consistency. All right, good. So the next stage here, you've got the commit transaction. And lastly, take a look. Remember, we need to advance the counter variable. So to do that, I'm going to type the following. I will say set at counter equals at counter plus 1. And I want to tell you about one more variable, which is this variable here. Take a look. I'm going to say as follows. Select and then add double. And notice that shows up with a whole bunch of variables. These are global variables. And if you look at them carefully, these are global variables, you see? They're available everywhere, so they're called global. And one is here called trans count. So global variable, and then double at trans count integer, so transaction count. And then you can select its value and display it, for example, as transaction count. All right, let's take a look. So take all of this code and just give it one go. We'll make fixes if we need. So hit execute. Give it a second. It will take a little bit. Look at the messages, meanwhile, that show. Getting that little thing to appear. There you go. You see that? It says transaction count. So one row affected. And then you've got the transaction counts. And as you can see, they show mostly 0. Now you might ask yourself, what is the reason for that? And the reason that, as you can see, the transaction count always says 0. Take a look, right? It's from top to bottom, it's always 0, you see? But now let's take a look inside the table. So remember, we generated a table named temp. We filled it with values according to that. So let's see. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to say select star from temp. Let's see what's inside that table. And as you can see, we have IDs and we have values. And if I scroll, it's all the way on the bottom down to record 100, as you see here. So everything has worked, right? We've generated the table. We see it there in output. The only thing is that the transaction count always showed 0. That's not the most useful thing. So what we're going to do is this. Take a look. I'm going to take this quantity here. I'm going to drag it and put it within the begin transaction and commit transaction block. Right after the insert. Put it there, okay? So now let's take a look at the result of changing that one line, moving it into a different position. So remember, you very likely have temp, so I'm just going to drop it first. Good. And now I'm going to go through this process one more time. I'm going to recreate the temp variable. I'm going to recreate the temp table, fill it, and then let's take a look. So hit execute and give it a little bit of time to run. And if you look carefully on the bottom, it says now query executed successfully. So let's take a look here, and it says transaction count is 1. You see that? Everywhere. And that is so because remember, we begin the transaction, which is defined as inserting values into the temp table. Then we display the transaction count using select double add train count as a transaction count. And then once that happens, we commit the transaction. After that, we increment the counter, so we can go back to the top of the loop. And after that, we begin this block again. We begin a transaction, insert new values, get the next transaction count, which again will be 1, and so on. Now take a look here on the bottom. If I remove commit transaction for a second, remember just now when we ran it, we saw that the transaction count was 1 everywhere. You see that? Okay. So now I'm going to run it again in this form. I'm going to drop the table. I'm going to select this code here, hit execute, give it a second to execute. I want to take a look at the transaction count. Take a look, it's different. You see it goes 1, 2, 3, and so on. You see that? So this time, the transaction count is changed. If you scroll to the bottom, there are 100 transactions that occur. On the other hand, remember when I put in the begin transaction followed by the commit transaction, each one was basically considered an independent transaction. So you began it, you did it, and you committed it, and that was the end of it. That's it. If you, for example, don't have the begin transaction followed by the commit transaction, then the transaction count, that variable, just grows and grows and grows. Now remember, this here is a global variable. What does that mean, global variable? Let's take a look. So I'm just going to try to access it outside that entire while loop. I'm going to type select and then tran count like that. Okay, as transaction count. I want to see whether that will work for us. Okay, hit execute. All right, we do it. There you go, execute. And let's see what this gives us, whether it's anything useful. And it tells you there are hundreds of transactions, you see, completed here. Okay, imagine I take this entire thing here and I just put it in a go. So I'm going to say here, go, to break up into batches. Okay, can I still access a trend count out here? Take a look. So I'm going to try to run that again. Hit execute. And again, 100 transactions are shown. You see? One row affected, well, one value on 100. So this proves that trend count is accessible even outside a different batch. I'm going to do this one more time. Take a look. Imagine I try to type this. Select, for example, add and then counter like this. Okay, as counter. And as soon as I try to do that, you see the difference? It says here, must declare the scalar variable at counter. So I hope you see the difference between the two kinds of variables. The trend count, hover your mouse over it, global variable, accessible basically everywhere. Counter, accessible only here. And of course the reason is that I've got the go here. If I remove the go, notice counter becomes available down below because the underlining is removed. If I add the go, counter gets underlined red because it exists only within the batch, defined by the stopping go. So I hope you see the difference between these two variables. One is local, so one has a defined scope essentially as about here. And the other one, like trend count, is global, so you can access it many different places, even from batch to batch to batch. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.